they have demonstrated that economic growth can be achieved faster in their kind of system than it can in any other kind. And that is a momentous, that's a momentous achievement. Over the last 30 to 40 years, they have consistently grown, as measured by their GDP, 2 to 3 times faster than the United States.
大家好啊，最近这几年，西方对待我们的态度明显变了。以前是傲慢，后来是焦虑，现在是带着一种想不明白的恐惧。我最近看到一段海外学者的深度访谈，谈得特别透。他说美国花了几十年时间试图证明中国的经济模式迟早会崩，苏联呢就是前车之鉴。但等着他们突然发现一个问题，中国呢不仅没崩，反而用比苏联快得多的速度在关键领域实现了反超。这个让美国百思不得其解的中国密码到底是什么？这位学者用一个词给出了答案，叫做混合经济。他说中国创造了一个历史上从未有过的经济奇观，前30年学苏联，把重工业和基础铺好，后40年又没有走苏联那条僵化的老路，也没全盘照搬美国的自由市场，搞了个折中，一半呢是国有企业扛起国家安全、能源、基础设施这些不赚钱但很重要的大企，另一半呢是私有资本，用中国人的勤奋和聪明去拼杀国际市场。这不像美国幻想的那种二元对立，而是个货真价实的五五开。这个混合体由同一个强大的党政系统居中监督和协调。当国家定下某个方向，它不是靠发布一份没人看的文件，而是靠摁下总开关一样，让国企、民企、银行、高校一起唱。想一下，除了中国，还有哪个国家能做到这一点？那具体怎么体现呢？就拿 DeepSeek 爆炸式登场那件事来说，去年美国还在洋洋得意，觉得英伟达高端芯片一进，中国 AI 就会完蛋。结果呢，咱们用更少的算力、更低的成本，硬生生的搞出了世界一流的模型。他说这个冲击不亚于1957年苏联发射第一颗人造卫星给美国带来的震撼。对美国来说，这不是一个程序的好坏问题，这是个象征，它象征着你那个自以为远远甩在身后的对手突然出现在你的后视镜里了。而更让美国精英崩溃的是，中国不是靠举国体制蛮干成功的，而是靠民间力量野蛮生长。像 Deep 背后的焕方量化是典型的私人资本，而电动汽车里的比亚迪又算是国家扶持起来的民企龙头。大家看到了吗？这就是混合经济的优势，既不像苏联那样什么都靠国家，完全没有活力，也不像现在的美国什么都丢给市场，造个高铁都扯皮20年。中国让能挣钱的去挣钱，让能担责的去兜底。那为什么美国学不来啊？这位学者毫不客气地指出，美国现在陷入了一种意识形态的洁癖。在美国的语境里，只要是政府的就是官僚的、臃肿的、没效率的，只要是私人的就一定是有活力的、了不起的。他甚至拿马斯克来举例，特朗普让马斯克去精简政府机构，可大家想一想，马斯克自己就是个巨大的私人官僚机构的首脑，他的公司遍布全球，里面的条条框框一点不比政府少。但在美国人的想象里呢，私人企业家就是比公务员高贵。这套逻辑在中国完全反过来。我们承认私有资本的效率和冲劲，但我们也知道关键时刻能扛事的还是那些被某些人天天骂的国资和国企。我们相信混合所有制，相信私人老板把企业做大了是本事，但也得讲政治、守规矩。就像杰克马前几年被敲打一下，为什么呢？因为你得认清，在这个混合系统里，谁才是真正的主心骨。这种对公权力的尊重，美国人理解不了。如果我们把时间线拉长，看70年的大历史，你就能理解为什么这一刻是历史的必然。70年前苏联模式下的工业化和集体农业化确实有过高速增长，但始终呢缺少私人资本的灵活调剂，最后变得僵化低效。 而中国的这70年经历了苏联模式的实验期，后来果断切换到了混合模式。我们用40年走完了西方国家上百年的路， GDP 干到了全球第2。这里面有一组很直观的数据，美国的 GDP 是28万亿美元，中国呢是18到20万亿，而且差距在逐年缩小。再看看俄罗斯才3到4万亿，很多西方人到现在还把中俄打包看待，这纯属冷战思维的残留。而中国之所以能做到，就是因为咱们能用计划的手段稳住底盘，用市场的手段搞活经济。当国家决定在 AI 上发力的那一刻，私人资本的冒险精神、国有银行的弹药库、高校的科研积累，甚至海外留学生的力量，都能被整合进一个战略方向。而美国现在在干嘛？被恐惧所支配。这位学者说了句大实话，现在根本不是中国在咄咄逼人的挑战美国，恰恰相反，是美国害怕中国的增长，所以才必须去围堵你、拖慢你。中国想要什么？只是公平的自由贸易，只是想要继续发展，是美国自己需要制造敌人来维持团结。他甚至打了个非常有意思的比方，美国独立后，英国不是不服气吗？又打了一次独立战争，打完发现确实打不过你了，那就坐下来，最后大家一块谈，达成了一个默契，你玩你的新大陆，我搞我的日不落，大家各退一步，反而相安无事200多年。所以中国和美国为什么不能坐下来谈呢？为什么不能各退一步，共同繁荣呢？但现实是，美国人现在还处在一种极度亢奋的恶华幻想里，觉得自己可以像拖垮苏联一样拖垮中国。这位学者想提醒的是，中国不是苏联，一个能在人工智能、电动车、航天全面开花的经济体，它的韧性远超大家的想象。而关于这位学者，他叫理查德沃尔夫，是美国非常著名的一位学者。他对中美关系，尤其是对中国的一个剖析是非常精准的。话不多说，我们挑选了一些精彩的片段来看一下理查德沃尔夫的这个精彩的访谈。
The other thing I wanted to bring up right now isn't so much a policy issue, but just a broader domestic economic issue going forward, and one that I think your Marxist or Marxian, you've been using that word, analysis might be really helpful with. It also connects to DeepSeek, automation, electric vehicles, and that is the role of advancements in AI in the competition between China and the United States, and also just the overall health of our domestic workforce.
I don't know quite how to get at what it is I would want to say about that. China has demonstrated now, and I believe this is true to almost every reasonable person, whether they like China or not, whether they support what China is or don't. They have demonstrated that economic growth can be achieved faster in their kind of system than it can in any other kind. And that is a momentous, that's a momentous achievement. Over the last 30 to 40 years, they have consistently grown, as measured by their GDP, 2 to 3 times faster than the United States. I must remind people, even though they hate to hear it, that before this speedy growth, the Soviet Union accomplished speedy growth. Not as fast, but speedy growth. So that the painful reality, so painful it can't be spoken, is that the 20th and 21st centuries demonstrated the growth potential and the growth actuality most effectively in the Soviet Union and China. If you look at the Soviet Union as the first experiment in what I'm about to describe as their economic system, and China as the second, right? Russia starts in 1917, China in 1949. That's quite a difference. But by now, we have 70 years, roughly 70 years of the Soviet Union, and now 70 years of China. And the Chinese growth faster, more spectacular than the Russian. The Russians were a system of state enterprises throughout industry and a growing proportion of state enterprises in agriculture, and very little scope for capitalist enterprises throughout that time. Not zero, that's an American fantasy, but small. China is completely different. China made a decision to become a hybrid, to be partly state-owned and operated enterprises, half, and the other half private capitalist enterprises, both Chinese and external, allowed. So that I think it's fair to say that China represents a hybrid trying to combine both the benefits of a private capitalism model United States and of a state-owned and operated enterprise system, example, the Soviet Union. They really are a 50-50 split. With the hybrid of these two systems overseen by a communist party and a powerful state apparatus controlled by that party. And they've achieved really an unspeakable story. Let me give you one statistic just to put in your head. The GDP of the United States, 28 trillion bucks, more or less. The GDP of Russia, our former arch enemy, today, is $3 or $4 trillion. No content, nothing. And that was always true. I mean, only in the Cold War legacy mentality of the United States did Russia loom, silly economic nonsense. Anyway, that's not true with China. China's GDP now, 18, 19, 20 trillion dollars. Way different from Russia, and equally so from anywhere else. Britain's GDP, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 trillion, something like that. Very small.
Bigger than Russia, though.
What?
Bigger than Russia.
Probably bigger than Russia, yeah. And Russia fighting NATO means Russia's fighting Britain, France, Germany. Italy is refusing. That's different. But look what China has done. China was one of the poorest countries on the planet in 1949 and is now number 2. Unquestionably number 2 after the United States, and each year closing the gap. That is an astounding achievement. It is very, very hard for me not to dwell on it. But one of its components, and one of the reasons it has the achievement, will take us to the technology issue. A powerful communist party ruling a powerful state apparatus, supervising this hybrid, can do something quickly and efficiently that the United States either can't do or can't do quickly and efficiently. It can mobilize the entire economy to achieve certain priorities. It can mobilize the government sector in its ways and the private sector in its ways. It can force them to collaborate and coordinate so that the resources each has are brought together to attack a problem. It does not respect private profit as the priority, which is what happens here. It does not believe the private has to be given primacy in some sense, as happens here. It doesn't have a government filled with people who believe that the private is in some sense the more important, the more patriotic, the more deserving, the more what. It doesn't have any of that. In fact, it has the other. One of the elements of socialism or communism that has a real effect here is that the people involved in the public sector believe in it, respect it, even value it higher than the private. In recent years in China, you have seen programs punishing leading private capitalists, Jack Ma and others like that, kind of dressing them down, but mostly culturally saying, you are not, yet we will let you be a billionaire. We will. And we will let you run your business. But when you overstep in this hybrid, we're going to give you a slap on the wrist or worse, because you're not, and there's enormous support in the public sector for that. Americans have a very hard time grasping how different this is. Here in the United States, just by comparison, the presumption is that government is a bureaucracy full of unnecessary people, the fat. Economic fat. So Mr. Trump gets a lot of support for nominating the head of a private bureaucracy, Mr. Musk, to clean out the public bureaucracy, as if him being the proprietor of another bureaucracy didn't disqualify him. What? Why? What are you doing? What are you doing? This man has an enormous bureaucracy. He has a business that spans the whole world, or multiple businesses that span the whole world. He's got a complicated, overlapping mess of the bureaucracy, like all bureaucracy. But no. Instead, the mentality is the private bureaucracy is efficient, lean, effective. It's always the public bureaucracy that isn't, though. That's a completely different way of thinking about, and it translates into different little decisions along the way. Made in this office in Idaho and that office in Vermont, that because of this private profit, private public notions, remarkable, meant that in order to have a chance, China could mobilize its resources in a way that Europe could not. Europe didn't have the hybrid economic systems, way too much private, and they didn't have national unity, too much tension among the countries of the EU. So they could not mobilize, not across the public-private boundary, not across the national boundary. So they couldn't, and they didn't. But the Chinese, who had less of some kinds of resources than Europe, if you take Europe as a total, they could. And they're not going to change this because it's working. That's why they are able now to compete in AI. That's what the importance of the DeepSeek explosion was. It wasn't the details of one program versus another. These are they call learning modules. What this is about is a sign, which is, by the way, a number of American commentary made this, and they're right. They compared it to 1957. And because I'm old enough, I was alive then. I remember it. 1957, was when Russia, Soviet Union then, sent up a man in space, a Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin. I remember the name of the Russian astronaut who was there. And America went crazy because the whole notion that we were number one meant that we Americans would be the first in space. And here we're not just another country. That would have been bad enough. But the bad country had done it, you know. This is comparable. It's a sign that a country we thought was far behind us isn't. And I think you've seen a kind of quasi-hysteria already in Washington as the whole establishment reinforces itself. No, stop. Even though the war in Ukraine is with Russia, we really should be focused on China. My guess, I don't know, of course, but my guess that if Mr. Trump delivers on his promise to end the war in Ukraine, he will do so in the name of focusing on the much greater danger represented by China. The truth of it is, the Chinese at this point are not our problem because they don't need, all they want is free trade. All they want is to be allowed to do in the future what they've done in the past. It's the United States that has to have a change because it's terrified by the growth that the Chinese have achieved and that they look likely to continue. And therefore they have to be stopped. So what Americans cannot understand because they don't want to face it is that it's not that the Chinese are aggressive. It's really the reverse. It's the United States that's aggressive because it needs to stop what's going on. The Chinese don't. For the Chinese, let's go. You know, we know how to go. We know how to beat you. We know how to grow. We do it better than you do. So just let us. And the United States says, we won't. We're going to stop you. We're going to slow you. And it's almost as naked as that if you look at the press these days. And, you know, it's a question of whether the Americans have the means. I don't think they do. And have the determination, they may have that, to stay with this policy. I like to remind them that after Britain tried twice to punish the United States for becoming independent, Revolutionary War, War of 1812, they gave up. And they basically worked out a deal. Americans would leave them alone and the rest of the world do their British Empire. And the British would respect that the United States now had an empire called the Monroe Doctrine. You can take this Western Hemisphere. We're taking everything else. And on that basis, we can all live happily together. And they did. They didn't go to war against each other since that time. Okay, so why not the United States sit down with China and do more or less the same? I don't understand why that isn't talked about. I don't think that's because it isn't an option. I think it is. And I think Americans somewhere know that it is. But for the moment, they're all excited that they may have the ability just to blow the Chinese away, the way the Russians went away. And I think that's a mistake, but that's where we sit.